My name is James Trost, and this is A2 Insight. Today's guest is Professor John Branch of the University of Michigan. Welcome, Professor Branch, to our program.
Thank you very much. It's lovely to be here.
Well, we're very pleased to have you. What I'd like to start out with is just give us a lot of information about growing up, where you grew up, your early influences, academic interests and pursuits, and how did you end up at the University of Michigan here in Ann Arbor? So we'll have you start off giving us a lot of information about your
Certainly, great questions. Well, I was actually born in a small town about 2 hours north of Toronto in Ontario, Canada. And I started out my career as an engineer. I studied electronics as an undergraduate student and then spent a couple of years installing digital logic programmers in a steel factory. So you might ask the question, how did I end up in marketing? Well, like a lot of other engineers, I decided engineering was not for me, and I moved into an MBA program, trying to combine both the technical and the commercial. But the education bug bit me while I was doing my MBA, and I decided to continue on and study for a PhD, specifically in marketing. I did my PhD at the University of Cambridge in England, where I met an American woman who dragged me here to the United States, and we've been living here in America for about 20 years now. First down in Texas at Rice University in Houston, and then 5 years at Washington University in St. Louis. But for 13 years now, I've been a professor at the University of Michigan, teaching primarily in the field of marketing, but also in international business and strategy.
Well, I think that's a good place to start. One of the reasons I asked Professor Branch to be on our program is that he's written a book which I think is fascinating, and I think is certainly applicable to the people who live here in Ann Arbor and the university community and the larger community as well. That's called Globalization and Higher Education. There are a lot of changes that are going on, various things are happening within the world of higher education, and so I guess my first question to you would be, why the interest in this specific subject matter?
Well, I've always been interested in international business, primarily because I've spent half my life now living as an expatriate. I left Canada when I was 25 years old. I'm 51 this year. My first destination was Central Europe in the early 1990s, so just after the Berlin Wall came down. I then spent some time living in Central Asia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Uzbekistan, and then found myself teaching at a business school in France for 4 years before I moved to England to do my PhD. So international business, international marketing, globalization has always been an interest of mine, not least because I've been living it. Why the globalization of higher education? So about 6 years ago, I switched much of my scientific research away from marketing into the field of education writ large. And simultaneously, I decided to undertake a second doctoral degree. Call me crazy. Yes, call me crazy. The focus of my doctoral dissertation was on the globalization of higher education, specifically on the strategies which universities follow to internationalize themselves. And recently I've been publishing more and more in this field of education, and specifically in the area of globalization of higher education.
Well, that's an important aspect, particularly here locally. What a lot of folks don't know is the University of Michigan has a very high percentage of international students that come from all over the world. China is way up there. We've got students from all over the world. What is the, or rather, what is the attraction specifically? When you've studied in Europe, you studied in Cambridge. The majority of international students up to this day come to the United States for academic study. What is the allure of institutions like the University of Michigan or other American higher education as opposed to other regions of the world currently?
I think it comes down to one thing: quality. The quality of higher education here in the United States, in my view, is second to none. So as a product, like any other product, higher education can be and is being sold abroad. In this case, sold abroad in the sense that students are moving from their foreign countries to the United States. Just like tourism is considered an export, when students come to the United States and study here, higher education in that sense is an export and is counted as part of American exports. Now, for me, what's particularly interesting is the internationalization of higher education, or the globalization of higher education, is as old as education itself. Why? Dating back to the 800s, when the very first university was founded in Fez in Morocco, students have been traveling far and wide to study abroad. So students moved from all over the Islamic world to Fez to study the Quran. Into the Middle Ages, 1200s, 1300s, 1400s, you would have wandering minstrels, right? Educational wandering minstrels traveling across the medieval European landscape in order to study at the higher education level. I suppose students coming to the United States, I suppose that students coming today to the United States is the equivalent of those wandering educational minstrels from the medieval times.
Well, that's an interesting analogy. They're coming here, but they're certainly studying different subjects than they were back then. A lot of the students are mainly interested in the sciences. I don't think we see very many international students coming here to study music or history or art history. And that does lead to something that is changing in higher education, and that is the competitive nature of our world is leading to, well, in fact, many institutions are dropping disciplines such as philosophy, history, my area, political science, sociology. What is happening to traditional academic studies in today's competitive world studies? Is everybody going to study engineering? What's going to happen to traditional liberal arts disciplines in this global world?
Fantastic question. Well, clearly STEM subjects are growing in popularity because of where the money's at. Rightly or wrongly, recruiters of companies are demanding that students are ready to hit the ground running. The irony, James, in my view, is that when you speak to recruiters, they're also saying, we want leaders, we want people who can communicate, we want graduates who are logical thinkers and can come up with clever ideas, which for me, and probably to you also, are the disciplines of the liberal arts. So I find it a little bit odd that so many students are pursuing the STEM and, of course, my field, business, in pursuit of jobs, even though recruiters are still asking for the skills and the mindsets of liberal arts graduates.
Well, that's encouraging since I have a liberal arts degree. I'd like to believe that it was some value in learning a variety of different subjects, but then at the same time, most institutions in this country have missions to educate people in a variety of disciplines. I mean, if you're in the business school, you're studying business, engineering school, you're studying engineering.
And if I might interrupt, excuse me, what's interesting is that the business school went through a redesign of its undergraduate curriculum a few years ago, and worked very, very diligently to ensure that it had a liberal arts feel. Indeed, it's a 4-year bachelor's degree in business administration, but the entire first year is spent in other colleges and schools of the University of Michigan. And even during the second, third, and fourth years of the BBA, students are given a lot of freedom and credits which they can use outside of the business school. So I think we recognize that recruiters want students who have accounting, finance, and the other disciplines of business, but at the same time are much more well-rounded, which liberal arts students have.
Well, that's good. At the same time, there are majors that are struggling. We have certain academic departments that are being cut from different institutions around the country. And then I guess students' interests are different, because if you're saying they go to the money, what will be the future as globalization continues? Are we going to see a decline in just, let's say, liberal arts education and a growth in STEM institutions? What's going to happen to the traditional model of the 4-year undergraduate liberal arts college?
Yes, have you got your crystal ball back here? We can gaze into it. So I feel this myself because I also have a second appointment at the university at the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies, CREES. CREES is one of several centers within the International Institute at the Faculty of Literature, Sciences, and the Arts at the university, which focus on area studies. And as you can imagine, funding for CREES and funding for the Center for And as you can imagine, funding for CREES and the other centers of the International Institute has fallen dramatically in the last few years, which is unfortunate for me because of my appointment there and my colleagues who are interested in Russian, East European, and Eurasian studies. Interestingly enough, however, when Russia invaded or took back, depending on your viewpoint, Crimea, enrollments in Ukrainian studies shot up, almost doubled, indeed. I hate to put on my marketing hat too much, but higher education is a market. And students today are considering themselves to be customers, and they're choosing disciplines which they believe are getting them the jobs. Take off my marketing hats and put on my liberal arts hat, it's a disappointment to me because I believe that society needs a breadth of people, and I hope that the liberal arts do not go the way of the dodo bird or the personal digital assistant.
Well, that's encouraging, I think, at one level. But as you mentioned, the globalization is also a product of the technological revolution, and one of the major transitions that we're seeing is the introduction of online education. We don't need to, the students today stare at their boxes. They don't see the need to be sitting in a classroom listening to somebody pontificate, no offense, for an hour, 3 times a week. I have a nephew who just got a master's degree from Georgia State University in software engineering. Works for IBM, and he never went there. He never even once visited the school. He has a master's degree from Georgia State. It was all done online. How are the technological innovations, I mean, it leads to, we talk about the globalization. If I'm a great student in India, why do I need to come here at all? Why can't I just do my entire degree online, as opposed to going back to the investment of coming overseas when it should all be able to be done with the online, with the internet?
I don't take offense, and indeed, like you, I've been thinking a lot about this, and we at the Ross School of Business have also been thinking a lot about this. How do you compete in a globalized educational market wherein, as you pointed out, there is a technology, or there are technologies which allow us to deliver information around the world? But I think that last phrase which I used is apropos. We believe, and many educators believe, that there is a distinction between delivering information and educating. That is to say, the internet is a great place for delivering information. Indeed, the internet is an electronic Wikipedia, right? There is no end to the information which you can get on the internet. And for us as business educators, we can deliver a lot of information, or perhaps endless information about business through the internet, on the internet, by the internet. But education is more than just information. Education requires interaction between students. Education requires the development of skills, and skills are much more difficult to develop on the internet. It also requires the ability to discern different contexts and which contexts are most appropriate for using those skills and that particular information. So, the Ross School of Business and other business schools and other universities around the world have decided to play in the distance education world, but Ross has decided to do what we would call hybrid education, where we combine both the information delivery mechanisms of the internet along with residential sessions which leverage interaction between students and interaction between the students and the professor. And we believe that this hybrid method, this hybrid version of higher education will continue to be valuable, for which students will pay us money and will want to come to lovely Ann Arbor, Michigan.
Well, that would be the hope from certainly from the community standpoint, because international students, as well as students from out of state at this institution, as I'm going to pull you a little bit into the political world pay more than a student who's a graduate of an area high school. Now, the University of Michigan is a public university, and there are valedictorians and kids at the top of their class that don't even get in.
Mm-hmm.
Now, what comes with diversity of globalization and everything else, and people paying twice as much from out of state to come here, does kind of limit sometimes the accessibility to those of us who have children who are in this state. At the same time, we do have something the federal government has done, which is the expansion of student loan acquisitions, which of course has been an amazing increase, and of course we owe more money in student loan debt now than even credit cards. So I guess looking at the future of globalization and our own education, that you already told us that the American system is premier currently in terms of attracting international students. And if I work at a university and I want to make money, I want to bring in, you said it's a market. How are we going to keep these institutions from becoming elitist in the sense that kids can't even get into their own state university? And this is a problem, by the way, here in Michigan. Mm-hmm. How would you address that?
Whew, that is a good, a political quagmire. So a couple of thoughts. I don't know if I have the answer, but a couple of thoughts which come to mind. The first is I would argue, and I think others would agree with me, that the reason why the American higher education system is second to none is that it has operated in a market-based system. If you look at European universities where students can attend for free or almost free because higher education is 100% publicly funded, the universities are not as competitive. There is not the same market-based oomph which drives students and professors to excellence. I think some of my European colleagues would disagree with me there, but nevertheless. Another thought is when you compare private elementary K through 12 education with public K through 12 education, there is a phrase which I've always liked. You are a recipient of public education, but you are a customer of private education. And again, putting my marketing professor hat on, there is something about market-based competition which drives innovation, and innovation drives competition, and you get that virtuous circle going. And I think that higher education, like private K through 12 education here in the United States, has benefited from the innovation competition virtuous circle. Without knowing too much about the funding model of higher education in the state of Michigan, I'm hazarding a guess that the money which comes from Lansing is not enough to cover the cost of educating a student fully. And so consequently, the university does need to have full fee paying students, either in-state or out-of-state students, in order to cover the costs of running the university. There's another component which we need to take into account, which is that the mission of a university is not just about education, it's also about scientific research. There's a broader public mission, even global mission, in the sense that a university ought to be challenging the status quo of human knowledge and pushing forward human knowledge. And that costs a lot of money, which is not necessarily covered by fees of fee-paying students. So where does that money come from? Some of it comes from industry, some of it comes from National Institutes of Health, the National Science Foundation, and so on. But clearly some of it can also come from foreign students who pay above fees.
Mm-hmm. Well, you certainly are a proponent of the market-based approach to education. And I would assume there are other countries in the world, you've taught in several. I can't imagine that there aren't various countries and other folks around the world, some being market-oriented, that would like to end the predominance of our educational model and have students come into their countries. So as you look around the world and the market-based approach that we have, certainly Europeans, we would argue it's a more knowledge-based, to be going to school and having it subsidized, the assumption being that the students get in based on their academic report. They don't pay for it, it's subsidized. What markets in the world today are looking at us and saying, why can't we keep them here? You've seen the globalization. I can't imagine that everyone wants to just acquiesce and say everybody should come to the United States. Are there other people who are seeing this in countries? What other markets are being more creative?
It's a great point, and what is interesting is that although we think of the United States as having the predominant higher education system on the planet, it was actually Australia, followed by the UK, and to some degree followed by New Zealand, which were the forerunners of this notion of globalization of higher education. So if you go back to the early 1990s, the conservative governments in in Australia and in the UK principally, reduced government funding for higher education, thereby forcing Australian and UK institutions to move beyond their shores to try to attract students. At first, it was attracting students from other countries to come to Australia and the UK to study, and then Australia broke that mold by doing what we have come to know as transnationalized higher education. And this is where universities set up shop in other countries. So just as Michigan can export its delicious cherries from northern Michigan to other countries, so did Australia export its education. Not by internet, because the internet wasn't really the thing in the early 1990s, but by setting up foreign branch campuses. So imagine if the University of Michigan, for example, had its own campus in Dubai or Durban, South Africa. Well, Australia is the dominant player on the planet, not the United States, Australia, in transnationalization or transnationalized higher education. Indeed, higher education is the third or fourth, depending on the year, third or fourth largest export of Australia after gold, iron ore, and coal. So you have at least 3 generations of Singaporeans, Indonesians, Malaysians, and others from Southeast Asia who have degrees from Australian universities. I think Australia has done an amazing job because whereas each university in the United States tends to control its own promotional activities and its own strategy, Australia decided to form an industry association, effectively a government-level department which represents all Australian universities internationally. The equivalent in the UK is called the British Council. These organizations do an incredible job at marketing Australian and British education. Not individual university education, but the entire educational system. And consequently, I think those are models which the United States might look to for advice and guidance on how to transnationalize higher education in the United States in more effective ways.
So what you're really arguing is that institutions, I would assume particularly elite institutions that are already known, that they basically expand campus locations so that somebody in Dubai necessarily has to come to Ann Arbor, but they could go to the University of Michigan in Dubai and run a class taught by Michigan faculty, I'd assume. How would you just the logistics of something like that? It's an expense.
Different universities have different systems. So some universities, instead of building their own foreign branch campuses, which would be a foreign direct investment, what they're doing is they're creating licensing agreements. So just as McDonald's will license to a franchisee in Abu Dhabi, the University of Wollongong from Southeast Asia would license its degree. It would create an entire system, a curriculum, and then the company which licenses that degree would use its own instructors. The foreign branch campus model is different. It is more like the Hilton Hotel, building its own Hilton Hotel in Morocco, and managing all of the operations. Sometimes Hilton would send over managers from the United States and workers from the United States, but sometimes Hilton would hire and train its own local staff. Similarly with higher education, sometimes it will have home institution faculty members who fly over to teach. Sometimes it will be locally hired and trained instructors.
Well, I guess then the question, because I would assume as in a business professor, you're basically arguing that government intervention, at least as it relates to Australia and New Zealand, was beneficial for the exporting dominance of these international. Do you envision that this could possibly be done at a national governmental level of the United States to try to have a similar model? Would you advocate for that as a member of the business community?
I think the first step would be to tackle it at the state level. I could very well see the state of Michigan developing a state of Michigan higher educational transnationalization committee, not unlike what it's done for exporting of small and medium-sized businesses, whereby the governor and a committee will do field studies and let me go back on that one. I'm not sure that implementing this at the national level would be an easy thing to do. We might begin first at the state level, whereby the government of the state of Michigan institutes some sort of higher education department, which would go on trade missions to try to push the idea of higher education in Michigan from a student coming here perspective, but likewise a university going abroad. Another thing which this reminds me of, which you might find interesting, is a new phenomenon which has appeared in the last decade. It's called university hubs, higher education hubs. This is where typically governments decide proactively to create a higher education hub. Consider the United Arab Emirates, for example, which has 40 foreign branch campuses in Dubai and Abu Dhabi. So the governments of those two emirates have created tax incentives, have created models to attract universities from abroad. Qatar is also an education hub with a number of foreign branch campuses, including Cornell University, which runs a medical college there. Botswana claims that it is the first African education hub. Singapore's government has set out for Singapore to become an education hub in Southeast Asia. The University of Michigan has not yet decided to participate in that, but I could see the university doing that, or I could see Michigan State or any one of our other fine universities in the state of Michigan participating in those educational hubs. Typically, as I said before, it is a government which decides whether or not to create an education hub in its cities or in its country.
Wouldn't that be interesting if we had other countries having their own educational hubs in our country?
Well, that goes back to the very first question which you asked, globalization of higher education. Is higher education like iron ore, hamburgers, and automobiles a global industry, and therefore the University of Michigan and other universities need to think of it as such?
So your argument would be, yes, it is. It's no different from hamburgers or iron ore, isn't it? It's an exportable product. It's great for our trade balances, I would assume, more than anything else. It's a service industry.
If I put on my marketing professor hat, then yes, it is an industry like any other industry, and the University of Michigan, Michigan State, Eastern, Central, Northern, Western, they all ought to be thinking of themselves as players in a global industry. And consequently, they need to stop thinking about Ohio State as a peer institution, as a competitor, and they ought to be thinking of the University of Bologna and London School of Economics and National University of Singapore as their competitors.
Well, actually, that sounds kind of exciting from a globalist perspective, but it also then goes back to the consumer. And this is a question, I think this is going to become much more important as we grow farther, particularly as it relates to the cost of tuition and everything else has gone up. I mean, when I think about what I was paying when I graduated from my undergraduate degree, consumers, parents, everyone else is going to say, I want to see a correlation between what I'm being taught and what I'm going to get as it relates to a salary. Now, we've already got people going after some of these for-profit schools saying, you know, you ripped me off and I paid thousands in loans and it was just a grab. Do you envision a time as globalization saying, we have a strata of, okay, you're going to go to this institution, employers are going to connect even more closely with them so that when I go to this school, if I graduate, I'm going to work for IBM or I'm going to Silicon Valley. Is this whole integration process, the whole concept of the globalization, no different than any other product, a guarantee, a warranty on education. Is this something you envision as a possible happening, or is that a bridge too far?
No, no, I think this is a good question. The word I think which I would use is accountability. Who is accountable for higher education? And it raises some very good political questions. Is the government accountable? Is it a market-based system, and therefore at the end of the day, buyer beware, right? Caveat emptor, right? Is that?
Caveat emptor. Mm-hmm.
Caveat emptor. Is it buyer beware? Ought we to be asking universities to demonstrate the value of an education? Is it accreditation agencies? Is it who is accountable for higher education? You raised the issue of price. I'm a father of 3. My oldest has just turned 16, so I'm thinking a lot about higher education. I believe that the University of Michigan offers an incredible value, but relative to Norway, for example, where higher education is free, including for foreign students, the University of Michigan is quite expensive. But the University of Michigan is relatively inexpensive if you compare it to out-of-state fees or swanky private universities, which are $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 all in. So does that bring us back to globalization and a market for higher education? Will I send my children to the Norwegian School of Economics for free? Will I keep them here at the University of Michigan? We shall see.
Well, I guess the one thing that is apparently becoming true is that knowledge for knowledge's sake is no longer a given. A knowledge for acquisition of employment or marketable skills seems to be the evolution of education and the globalization. Professor Branch, this has been a very interesting discussion. I certainly, with our audience, particularly here locally, Professor Branch teaches in the Ross School of Business here at the University of Michigan. Has 2 PhDs, I believe. It certainly is a scholar, to say the least. This is a subject I think we're all going to have to deal with because it affects us directly here in the local economy. The diversity of our campus, the changing demographics of who's coming to our institution. Thank you very much for being on our show. I really enjoyed our discussion. And again, your book, The Globalization of it, how can people read some of your work? And just type, how would they get access to your stuff?
If they go to libri.co.uk, that is the publisher in Oxford, England, and it has that book plus a number of other books on which I was a co-editor.
I'm sure you have extensive academic work. I will have that address, we'll have it at our credits at the end. So for A2 Insight, until next time, I'm James Trost.